Thank you, Charlotte. Good afternoon. Hopefully it's lunchtime, so you've got a drink and a snack, and we will just kick off on the timings today, because we've got a lot to cover. So welcome to our UK chapter. It's a combined chapter, as we're also launching our Nature and Biodiversity chapter today. We'll let Emma and Marina tell you more about that. And it's really how procurement can get started on nature. Will? For those of you, many of you are already SPP members and ambassadors, and I know that is fantastic. But I'm just going to take a couple of moments just to explain, in case you're new to the Sustainable Procurement Pledge. It all started about 3.5 years ago when two fantastic leaders, CPOs, stepped up to pledge themselves to drive more sustainability within procurement. And that was Thomas Addison, the CPO of Bayer, and Bertrand Concret of CPO of Henkel. And they recognised that large-scale change is needed, and us as procurement professionals have that ability to affect the deals that we are doing within our supply chains. And if we collaborate together with the knowledge that we can do, we can speed up all of the sustainable and the good work that we are doing. So we have, back up one, some principles for the pledges. So it really starts with yourself. We're not asking people to wait for their CPOs, their CFOs, their chief execs to embed sustainability. We're saying you as a procurement professional are empowered in the deals that you are doing, and that through our network we will help facilitate and point you to the right direction for training or for awareness or whatever else it happens to be. And it's about people standing up for our people and the planet, and that together through collaboration we will share our knowledge, listen to others, and change the world so that we can all leave that right legacy together. And you can pledge yourselves through our website. We can come on to that later if you haven't already. So we are part of the UK chapter. Sorry, Will, if you can click on. Our goal, first of all, before I talk about the UK chapter, is for us to reach 1 million procurement professionals to pledge to the SPP that they are going to make a dramatic change themselves by 2030. 75% of the people of that 1 million, we want at least that to confirm that they have been making more sustainable sourcing decisions because of their engagement with the Sustainable Procurement Pledge. So that is one of our many goals that we've got. Today, we are talking to you about our UK chapter. We have, within SPP, we have got a variety of chapters which are set up. Some are regional, some are for specific areas, or particular topics of interest of people. So within our UK team, we have got 6 of us now within our core team. You've got Will and myself here today who are running and helping to facilitate this session. And then you've also got Seb Bart, Claire, Carol-Anne and Hannah as well. Now, we've got a wider community and we're here to try and drive that UK engagement so you're equipped, empowered and encouraged to do the conversations that you need to do in your day job. You can find us under the LinkedIn UK SPP chapter. You can find us through the website, and you can always email us direct. I'll put those links in the meeting chat as we get going as well. So we're always wanting to hear from you, and if there are other topics which are of concern or interest to you, do just reach out and let us know. And click forward. So on to the main event today, which is what you actually wanted to join and hear about. And we're delighted so many of you could join us. So the conversation today is really building on our World Sustainable Procurement Day, where both Emma and Marina spoke with regard to awareness about nature and biodiversity in our supply chain. And we're now following that up with today's session on how you can really get started. Marina is our founder and managing director of Bemari, a fantastic consultancy focusing on sustainability within supply chains. And Emma Howcroft is a global sourcing sustainability director for Avantor and is actually doing some amazing work at the moment for nature strategy and building on some really practical applications that we've got. So, welcome. Let me hand it over to yourselves. Emma, I think it's your slides that you're going to share, isn't it, first of all?
It is. Hello, everyone. So let me quickly share my screen with you all.
Oh, before you get started, one quick housekeeping. We are recording this session, so we can share the link for anyone who cannot attend today who wanted to. Also, please, if you've got any questions as we're going through, put them in the chat or the question and answer box. We can use either. Please do reach out. We'll have time at the end where we can answer some of your questions. Sorry, Emma, back over to you.
All right. So guys, I'm gonna hide the screen. So if anyone needs to interrupt me, then by all means do. But hello all. I will be handing over to my colleague Marina shortly, but I'm going to introduce and start off the session on how can procurement focus on nature. So thanks very much for joining. So to keep it really simple and hopefully give you some easy takeaway tips, we've kind of created 3 scenarios. This is probably the weirdest agenda slide you've ever seen. So the first scenario is my company has no nature target. So what do I do there? The second scenario is my company has nature targets or nature related targets, potentially doesn't have a nature strategy or a nature narrative sort of surrounding those targets. And the third scenario is my company's going big on nature, has a clear nature strategy and narrative in short. So we're going to start with the first one. I can get my computer to work. Oh, perfect. Brilliant. And so we're going to focus on why is it important to procurement? What do we actually mean by nature? And then how to get started on carrying out a materiality assessment if you're in procurement. So why is it important for procurement and what do we mean by nature? So I think it's helpful to sort of step back and understand how does materiality assessment sort of present itself often in companies. And what we'll tend to find is that you'll have a corporate sustainability team or a sustainability person potentially, or someone that's just been given the role of sustainability. And their job is really to determine what should I focus on in my company. And often what you'll find is these folks tend to focus on what's within your 4 walls. If you're at a manufacturing site, often they'll focus on water and waste because they tend to be quite material areas of focus. But what often gets forgotten is just the impact that our supply chains have. So if you think about it, where are we getting all these products and resources from? They're being extracted from nature, either through mining, either through clearing land to grow things. And that's very much happening up the supply chain. And I think people in the center of organizations don't necessarily see it or have access to the data. And it's really procurement and sourcing professionals that really have the closest relationship with suppliers to be able to get hold of that data and understand really where the impact and dependencies lie. So being a sort of sourcing and procurement professional for many years myself, I know how frustrating it can be as a function to just focus on savings all the time. So the reason I would say this is important to us now is that this is probably one of the few opportunities our function has been given to really lead on a different topic area and do something big, I would say. And I think nature should be that one topic area that procurement folks can lead on. So how would you get started? So the first thing is figure out what's material to your company. So what is your greatest impact? What is your greatest risk and opportunity? Then determine what you're going to focus on. Set some targets and develop your narrative to convince people to actually do it. Obtain buy-in at a senior level. Communicate the change to your organization. And then hopefully get external comms to actually help you broaden that communication externally. And then start to set up for delivery. That made it sound very easy, but in essence, that's kind of what we should all really be doing. But I'm now going to hand over to Marina, who's going to focus a little bit on why is nature important and also sort of help you get started on materiality assessments.
Thank you very much, Emma. And thank you very much, everyone, for joining. And I'll just take you through some of those steps that Emma mentioned and what that actually means in practice. And before we dive into the answering and the practical actions, let's get the definitions straight and clear first, because nature and biodiversity are those 2 terms that are often either used interchangeably or just simply found really confusing. So the very first starting point is what is nature? Nature is actually everything that is around us, that is animate or inanimate. And that's probably quite complicated in that sort of level. But if you start breaking it down, water, that all of us probably are very familiar with in terms of supply chain impacts and targets, is part of nature. But so are metals and minerals, which is probably some of the inputs that you have for some of the products, or maybe some of your supply chains are definitely reliant on some of the metals and minerals. Land and landscapes, we're all going to have some sort of buildings or facilities, or maybe utilizing some of the warehousing, and some of the supply chains would definitely have some facilities on specific land that will have an effect on what landscapes may currently be sitting there or used to be there before. So any kind of use of land also becomes part of nature and our interface and dependency. If you think about habitats and ecosystems across things like atmosphere and oceans and land, so any kind of interaction with what used to be nature and now maybe an urban environment, or maybe any other type of environment that's more industrialized, and where we fit in that, depending on what kind of industry your business is in, is also going to be your interface and therefore going to have an impact on there. And one that's often kind of misunderstood or probably missed is climate conditions and ecosystem services. And what that basically means is nature is actually what we see around us and how we maintain the kind of conditions that make our life thrive, the food grow, and generally our shipping lines move along smoothly and nobody's getting affected, and we can predict what's about to happen. So actually we can plan what our supply chains would look like. Biodiversity, being at the heart of all of this, actually makes all of this work, go around, and be functional. So if you think about that kind of relationship and just breaking down at the very basics, anything we're going to be drawing from any of these aspects or relying on to make sure business is successful and supply chains operate will then have some sort of interface. So what might that look like if you take an example of a product? So let's imagine for a second that all of us are in a cosmetics industry. And if you don't mind clicking through.
I'm desperately trying. Okay.
Yeah. So whilst we click in, let's try to imagine that we are in a space of cosmetics or personal care products. And for example, we are either selling or manufacturing or sourcing a cream or any parts of that. So actually to have that cream and to create that, you will be definitely relying on a lot of different natural resources. It may be palm tree, which is quite ubiquitous across different products. So maybe palm tree derivatives. You may have some cocoa butter or cocoa shea or shea butter that you may be relying on. You might also have things like glycerin, which doesn't sound like an agricultural product, but actually it is. And that's, again, going to be in quite a lot of different products that we utilize in day to day. And therefore, as a supply chain management is going to be something that's going to be critical input for a lot of different products. There may be things like really rare inputs and ingredients, like wild harvested ingredients, rose, for example, or anything else that may be quite rare and therefore gives us uniqueness that as a sourcing professional, we're going to have to find and kind of negotiate around. But even if you're not going to be in the space of the cosmetics or personal care products, we're all probably going to have some sort of category of sourcing of packaging. And packaging means trees, packaging means paper. So where trees are grown, how they're managed is also going to be an interface and a dependency on nature. But if you take it broader, everything has to be shipped. So as part of supply chain networks and those logistical solutions tend to actually cross a lot of the seas and from port to port. Shipping is very reliant on stable climate. So first of all, we can predict where it's going and what sort of route, etc. But it's also very reliant on the water, not having stormy seasons or any kind of events that would be either delaying it or actually causing significant damage to the cargo. And one of the other aspects in terms of ecosystem services is we still need the system to operate the way it does. So all of the ingredients that we rely on contain the same kind of nutrients and have the same sort of functionality. So we don't want to have droughts. We don't want to have any wildfires because it's going to affect the products and quality and what we essentially going to put in our products. So from this example, hopefully you can see that the very simple product that we probably all have on our shelves, so many of your businesses may be in some way, shape or form linked to and sourcing some of these components, there is a lot of the not just ingredients coming from nature, but there are interfaces which essentially become your dependency. And supply chain procurement professionals would actually be the ones who will have better visibility as to what those dependencies are, where they are in the world, and which aspects of nature we're actually talking about. So if you take that as a starting point, how would we then start figuring out what the material topics are and how would we prioritize? So first of all, there's probably going to be a set of tools that you could be relying on, and that's market is increasing. So we're just going to share a few examples with you. So if you're going to make an absolute start, there's a complete jungle of lots of different tools, handbooks, and standards out there. but we would recommend that if you make a start, you make a start here. So the top 3 tools that we're sharing with you, Nature Strategy Handbook, TNFD LEAP Approach, and Natural Capital Protocol, are actually more of a framework. So these frameworks and guidelines will help you figure out what the sequencing of steps are, why are we doing this, and what kind of questions do we want to be answering, and how do we go about it in a more structured manner. Nature Strategy Handbook actually also provides more resources and links for every step. So if you wanted to have a one-stop shop as a starting point to cover how to conduct assessments, how to figure out what to disclose, what sort of targets to pick, and how to figure out what's relevant for your industry, this would be a really good starting point. TNFD LEAP approach is really useful in terms of also progressing with understanding what the impacts are and how to go about addressing them and planning them. And that's the kind of disclosure that's now been encouraged by a lot of different sustainability frameworks that some of your businesses may be subject to. A Natural Capital Protocol supports a broader understanding around the measurement and the value of the different nature-related capital that your business is going to be reliant on. So it's a good starting point of just getting a bigger picture and understanding the context and having a bit more of a structured approach to that journey. The 3 examples at the bottom, Encore, SBT and Materiality Screening Tool, and WWF Risk Filter Suite, are really the tools to start getting a deeper dive and pinpointing what the material topics might be for your sector. So they're actually helping you make sense of all of the different kind of interfaces, dependencies, and potential risk implications. But as they are applied to your location or maybe to your particular industry and sector, where do you need to start looking first? And these tools are really useful in terms of understanding where you may have risks in the supply chain, or maybe where some of the sensitivities lie. For example, there may be some water stress regions, and are those the regions where you're sourcing from? Well, that's a good starting point for you to start digging a little bit deeper and figuring out what actions you could be taking. So if you take these tools as a starting point, what might this look like in terms of progressing through the actual material topics and targets? So if you move on to the next slide, please. We can make a start in very simple steps. So if we first figure out what the key inputs and procurement categories are, that obviously is something that you will be very familiar with, but which ones of those would be nature derived? And this is similar to what we just looked at in terms of nature derived being either you're sourcing from nature or you're dependent on something that nature provides to us. So stable climates, so actual agricultural ingredients, or actually minerals and metals. The next step would be to use the Encore tool. So that's one of the tools on the previous slide, but here you can see a screenshot of what you might see if you were to log in and pick a sector that your business is in, and then start looking at what kind of hotspots or material topics or issues that will have high, medium, or low materiality rating. You can see there is the red circle there indicating that groundwater is specifically a high materiality rating for this particular sector. And then you can start going through the bit more details, because it also gives you an opportunity to explore a map and look at how this would vary by regions and give a little bit more details behind that. But it's a really good starting point to start looking at something that matters based on the scientific evidence and the research. Once you've mapped out some of those high materiality rating and maybe medium materiality rating from Encore, you can start looking at which categories within your procurement world would actually be the priority as a result. And that's obviously going to be a mix between what's most important based on Encore, but also where are your highest areas of spend, where do you have the biggest area of control, or perhaps you have the bigger degree of reliance. So it's a bigger risk if all of a sudden that particular input isn't available to your business. So that risk profiling becomes also quite critical. It's not just about the impact on nature, but actually if that disappears, what does that mean for your business? So business criticality also will feature here in terms of evaluation. And once you've done that assessment and you've picked your top categories, and it may be a good idea to start with 2 or 3 rather than ranking all the way down, identify 1 or 2 targets or actions that you can take now to start reducing those impacts. And essentially what this process is asking you to do is, or giving you a bit of roadmap for, is answering how much, where, and does it actually matter in relation to the inputs that we draw from nature. And at the high level, that will get you started in terms of understanding what really matters and where your impacts are. Once you have identified your top priorities, what kind of actions and levers actually might be available to you? Actually, quite a lot. And very often it's probably going to be the kind of things that you're already doing, but may not necessarily be badging as nature, or maybe you don't necessarily have quite an understanding of how important they are. So here's examples of 5 levers of what you can actually do. You can reduce consumption of resources, protect vulnerable species and habitats, you can reduce your carbon emissions, you can reduce waste and pollution, and you also can get better data and transparency. And all of this are very closely linked to biodiversity loss drivers. So if you focus on all or even 1 or 2 of these, this is going a really long way towards being able to take action on nature. And on the right, some of these bullets are examples of the actions and areas of targets that you can start implementing. So from your prioritization exercise, you've landed on some of the top 3 topics, and then you can start setting targets. Some of you may already have the carbon targets and maybe requesting carbon footprint data for the goods or for the components that you're purchasing from your suppliers is also going to be a really good starting point. But looking at things like, do we have organic agricultural inputs, and do we even have an understanding of what kind of agricultural practices are within our supply chain? Do we have any wild harvested materials? Could we have a target around reducing that or actually avoiding and getting it down to 0? So some of those examples would be a really good starting point, as they may be relevant specifically for your business. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an idea for this first scenario in terms of what the relevance is and what you can do. And hopefully some of these things are very practical and you can take away from today. Thank you, Emma. I'll hand over back to you.
Perfect. So guys, we've kind of done the first phase here, and hopefully some of you will have walk away from the session. You may not have thought you had targets and realize that your company's probably already focusing on nature. It's just that they haven't packaged it under a nature narrative. But what we'll go now is onto the second bit. So let me just remove this from the screen. So let's look at a company that does have nature targets, but perhaps hasn't repackaged it under a nature narrative. And let's now ask ourselves, sorry, I'm trying to click forward here. Okay, brilliant. Does it make sense to repackage your nature targets under a nature narrative and strategy instead? So on the screen here, you've got actually an example of a FTSE 100's set of nature targets. And I'm calling this out because I think they've positioned this really nicely, but I also want to kind of highlight that a lot of what they're doing, you could have actually had as just ordinary sustainability targets and not actually talked about nature. So there is something to be said about just carrying on with what's material and then repackaging it under a nature narrative to help people understand the interdependencies of all these sustainability targets and how they all sort of contribute to improving nature. And I think that's really the key that we have to get across. So interestingly, under freshwater, you've got your standard water target. So you've got water stewardship, you've got reducing water usage, and you've got achieving water neutrality. And they have different targets because different sites will have different types of risks and material issues associated with them. Under land, and I would say land is probably one of the most complicated ones, partly because I don't think we've got the best tools for assessing land risks in sourcing, I would say. You do perhaps in an agricultural and a mining level, but let's face it, if you're a sourcing person sitting in an office, that's not going to necessarily be hugely valuable to you. And that, I think, is where we're all struggling as sourcing and procurement professionals at the moment. But interestingly enough, this company has gone for 2 targets here. One is, let's improve biodiversity at our sites. Now, I'm pretty sure biodiversity is not a material issue at their sites, but it does make sense to actually do something at your sites first so you can build capability and leadership so that when it comes to then tackling the supply chain, you can actually lead properly, as opposed to asking your supply chain to do something without actually having tried to do it yourself. The second one there, which is 100% of agricultural and forestry derived materials sustainably sourced and deforestation by 2030, I would imagine will be a sustainable sourcing certification route that they're following. And then with oceans, this is quite an interesting one. So we've talked about impacts. How do we impact nature? And we've talked about dependencies. How do we depend on nature, or how do our businesses depend on nature? I would say with the oceans one, this is interestingly a dependency one. So this is one where they are probably extracting a key ingredient from the ocean, from an animal in the ocean, or animals in the ocean, I would say, and they need to find a way to do it sustainably, mainly so that animal doesn't die and they can continue to extract that ingredient because it's active and it's important. And that's a really good example of a dependency one, and actually a very good one of biodiversity as well. But it's great the way they've labelled it oceans, and they thought about the narrative because that makes more sense to their stakeholders rather than perhaps saying species protection. And that's what I mean about repackaging. How you communicate things is actually critical on how you actually achieve progress. Atmosphere, I would say this is very much about sort of reducing greenhouse gas emissions again. But the great thing about putting it into a nature narrative is that they're showing how integral reduction of greenhouse gas emissions is on nature, and also means that they can actually bring in greenhouse gas storage solutions as well. And nature's a brilliant greenhouse gas, well, it's carbon dioxide store. Nature's brilliant at that too. So it's a great way of bringing these two topics together. And then waste and materials, again, we see this a lot in people's sustainability strategies. At the end of the day, if you're recovering your waste better, you're extracting less from nature. So again, it is a nature topic. So hopefully this gives you a sense of comfort that when you say the word nature, you don't have to run off and try and do something completely complicated and crazy. And in actual fact, a lot of you are probably already focusing on nature, but there's a way to communicate it to get better results and more momentum. Right, so what should you consider if you're going to repackage your nature targets into a cohesive nature strategy? And I've put a few stakeholders on here. So internal stakeholders. So interestingly enough, employees actually love biodiversity and nature-related topics. That's a known fact. It seems to resonate a lot with them, especially those that have gardens, because they can immediately go away and do something. So the question to ask yourself here is, if you were to repackage all of this under a nature narrative and go big on nature, would that help mobilize your employees, and would that actually get them excited about what it is that you're doing from a sustainability perspective? Your suppliers, are they already using a nature narrative? Are they already talking about nature? Are they already ahead of the game on this? Or are they not? And then if you're lumping everything under this massive nature sort of narrative, could that be confusing to them? Could it just be a bit too big? Is it actually better to go to suppliers with a pick and mix sort of communication strategy, where those that are doing badly on waste can focus on waste, those that are doing badly on water can focus on water, and so forth? So consider how your suppliers are going to receive this and what's the best way to communicate these efforts to them. Investors, some industries are expected to now focus on nature. Are you sitting in one of those industries or in an adjacent industry? Is it coming to you next? Because the financial community is very much focusing on this as well, following the Dasgupta report. Regulators. So we've got CSRD, we've got CSDDD, we've got we've got the EU deforestation regulation. We've got a lot of reporting coming up. So the question is your company already having to report on this stuff? And could you piggyback onto what it's having to report to kind of help navigate how you actually set up nature in your business and communicate nature to all your other stakeholders based on what you're doing from a regulatory standpoint? Peers and competitors. So what are your peers doing? Are they doing stuff on nature already? Are they talking about it? Have they repackaged yet? And could you potentially take a leadership approach on it? And then I think this sort of segues nicely to customers, because if your customers are still focusing heavily on greenhouse gas emission reduction, if you come up with a sort of massive nature plan, will that seem confusing to them? Will they be annoyed that you're not focusing on greenhouse gas emissions anymore and going big on nature? Are they behind the times? And then if you go big on nature, can you associate that to your product and service value proposition? So could this be a great way to actually sell more products and be a little bit more innovative? So lots of things to consider on how you communicate nature-related activity to your stakeholders, I would say. And I would say if you actually get the comms right, a lot of the other stuff will follow. Right, so we've done the second scenario. Let's go on to the third scenario, which is my company has got it all in hand. It's got a big nature strategy and targets. Now, something I didn't pick up here is that just because your company might be doing all this stuff, do you keep questioning, have they really taken into account the supply chain? And if they haven't, because sometimes they don't, you can see from all these arrows here, I'm sorry, I didn't do it on the second one, but you can see if they haven't taken into account the supply chain, do actually take a leading role in actually figuring out whether the supply chain is material. And do take the time out to do this, because A, it's interesting, and B, it's fun, and hopefully it's more fun to do than just doing targets every day and savings targets every day. So let's imagine now that your company has a great nature narrative strategy and targets, they've got it all in hand, and then the question is, well, how am I going to communicate this to my suppliers? So here at the top, I've put engaging your suppliers, because it's not just communication, it's sort of bringing them on a journey, isn't it? And I've got 5 things to kind of mention. So on supplier communication, I think this is really tricky because there's different levels of maturity up and down the supply chain. So I think the first thing is sort of mentioning expectations. So what is it that you're actually expecting them to do, and be really clear. And I would say you can never communicate enough in a way. Really think about how you frequent this communication. The next bit is go to the right person in the supplier. So interestingly enough, if the company, let's say, is focusing on water, waste, packaging, they're pretty much focusing on nature, because they're looking at resource utilization, they're looking at water, they're looking at waste, and then you suddenly come in to the wrong supplier contact, potentially the sales team, which is often who deals with procurement and sourcing, and you go, we're getting big on nature, we're doing all of this, blah, 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 blah. And then they sort of turn around and go, well, we've got our priorities, thanks very much. Yours don't seem to align, so no, thank you. So that's the first thing, is if you don't go to the right person, it's likely that you will be shut down, or you just won't get the level of enthusiasm that you were hoping for. So right person is key. And then knowledge sharing is key as well. So if your company has gone to the trouble of figuring all this out, you must share how you did it with your suppliers. And I think there's this terrible view that once you figure out your own house, you just sort of communicate a need to your supplier base and they should just run off and do it. And I don't think that's fair. I think you need to explain the journey you've been on, how you've gone about it, so that they can actually do it faster. And the little diagram I've shown here is the idea of resources going up the chain. Every time you go up the chain, often, not always, you go to smaller companies with less resources, less manpower behind them to be able to do this stuff. So the more you can help at the bottom towards the top, the more likely you'll progress. And this goes to timing then. So if you're doing all this communication, it's likely that you're in the mobilization stage. But what you have to recognize then is your suppliers may not have even got to the assess stage. And so suddenly they now need to assess, prioritize, commit, and mobilize. And that can take 6 months to 2 years, potentially, depending on size of company and complexity of company. So the point is, if you're not knowledge sharing how you've done it, and they have to go through this process, that's going to take them time. So the more knowledge sharing you do, the faster you can speed up this process. And God, just a really bad example is if it takes 2 years for people to set themselves up, and you've got 10 levels in the supply chain, you can just imagine you've got a 20-year period before everyone sort of sorts themselves out. That's worst case scenario, I would say. So then supplier training. So I've put acceptance here because, interestingly enough, let's say you want your suppliers to focus on biodiversity and they've already done their materiality assessments and said, well, we're not going to do biodiversity. But in actual fact, the training gives them the information that they need to actually reconsider that statement. You kind of need them to accept it first to actually go off and do the training in the first place. It's a bit of a catch-22. The training also needs to be accessible. There's so many resources out there. How do you make it easier to access? Consider languages, especially when you're dealing with Asia and sort of other parts of Europe. Paywalls, there's this assumption that everyone has lots of money to be able to sort of buy this stuff. They don't, and I think that needs to be considered. And maturity. Some of your suppliers may be ahead of the game here. And in actual fact, your activities may slow them down. So it's really good understanding just the different levels of maturity you have in the supply chain. And then the fourth one, supply materiality, and this goes back to maturity. Now, you have to get alignment. You've decided that a topic to your company is important. It might not be important to your supplier. So it might be key to your business, but they're only buying, it makes up 1% of their total products bought, for example. So tiny for them. So you have to get alignment with your supplier on why things need to be focused on certain things versus others and how they need to work with you to do that, especially where the materiality doesn't line up. Some of this is positioning. So can you position it better? And that goes to the point I made about communication and repackaging. And then revision. So the difficulty here is that you may have decided something's material. Has your supplier now given you more information on a topic to determine that you need to revise your materiality assessment? And I think people need to be a bit more flexible about changing things as they get more data, because as the world progresses, we will get better data, hopefully, fingers crossed, and that will help us make better decisions on what to focus on in the future. And then probably the fifth one, which is a bit vague, but I think sometimes people struggle with these sort of new targets, should we say, or new focus areas, because they're not getting the same messaging as, let's say, their customers. So I think the more we can convince everybody to get into the relevant sort of collaboration bodies and groups, I think the better it will be for all of us, because we'll all be hearing the same message and singing from the same hymn sheet. So do try and encourage your suppliers to join these industry bodies so that it's not just you appearing in them, getting this information, and then having to find a way to sort of farm it up the supply chain. And I think that's it, folks. So just so you know, we're going to start our new Nature and Biodiversity SPP chapter shortly. What we're trying to do is to get a whole load of exciting speakers set up first before we communicate out. And do feel free to contact myself or Marina if you want to know more. But I'm now going to hand over to Will and Joe for Q&A.
That was brilliant. Thank you very much, Marina and Emma. Some really fascinating points, and we've got some great questions. So I will jump straight to those. So the first from Charlotte, I guess, is around small scale materiality assessment. So Marina, you had lots of great tips and tools, but if you're a smaller company, was there anyone in particular that you would recommend?
I think if you're a smaller company, I would still start with identifying what kind of inputs you may be reliant on nature. Then have a look at which ones is your business absolutely dependent on and start those, because if that's the ones that we need to worry about, you want to make sure you know exactly where they're coming from, what they may be exposed to, and whether or not you do have any issues. And the next one, I would look at any of the types of inputs that currently may be in the planetary boundary overshoot. So if you think about the kind of natural requirements and resources that we utilize in climate is what we're all familiar with, but there are going to be other planetary boundaries we need to worry about. So if they're going to be in overshoot, and biodiversity and water would be those two examples, and you're relying on those, or you have them somewhere in your supply chain, I would add them to the mix.
Can I add something there as well? I think, do you use the Encore tool that Marina shared? Because it's quite good in just highlighting, like, soil's a problem, water's a problem, biodiversity's a problem. And then if you use the WWF risk filter, it will tell you then what your risk is at a site level. So you can use Encore to say, what are the risks? And then quickly jump on the WW risk filter to find out at a site level what your issues are. The problem is that if you're doing this for your supply chain, you would then need to ask your supply chain to do that exact same thing and replicate that process. And that's where it gets a bit complicated.
Great, thank you, Emma. A question from Leroy is, would you not call nature a stakeholder to give it prominence and place it in the room rather than a sort of third party? Anyone got any views on that?
If I may, absolutely. I think clearly we're probably reading and speaking to in sort of similar environments because nature is absolutely a stakeholder. And what's really interesting about that is the CSRD reporting requirements are calling it out specifically and very explicitly. So nature as a stakeholder is the concept. So that's definitely the first step of considering what is the relationship with nature, and therefore as a stakeholder, what would it be worried about or concerned about or needs us to talk about or do. But the other way to consider that is actually then thinking about where that nature fits into your business anyway. So what is the relationship with nature? And if you're thinking about a stakeholder, how can you bring the stakeholder into the room? So how do you bring representation into your material topics? How do you bring nature in the conversation in the boardroom level? How do you bring that at the level of the procurement functions or any kind of other functions? And there's actually a number of mechanisms that have been developed by various organizations that give you a pathway and tools to do exactly that at various different levels of complexity, from very formal structures and representation of a nature at the board with like legal setting and legal standing, to informal, starting from just awareness and this kind of conversation we're having right now.
That's great. Thank you, Marina. Another question from Alistair is, when assessing a potential new supplier, as a minimum accepting ISO 14000 certificate as evidence, they are doing good things for nature, okay, or should they demonstrate more? So I guess, yeah, when you're assessing a supplier for their nature track record, is there an ISO equivalent like 14000? How would you assess?
I certainly can't answer the ISO question, guys, but what I would say is be clear on what it is that you're measuring, and then ask the supplier questions in relation to what you've decided to target and measure. The only reason I say that is we actually sit within the supply chain, so we have both customers and we also have suppliers, and I'm often quite shocked by just the sheer amount of things that we get asked on things that don't necessarily ladder up to a focus area at the customer side. So if you're going to ask your suppliers questions, be really clear on how that question allows you to achieve progress on something that you need to focus on in nature. So that's how I would actually determine what to ask.
And just to add on the ISO point, absolutely agree with what Emma is saying. You first need to be specific on the kind of problem you're trying to solve, and that's not necessarily what ISOs give you. And there is, in fact, going to be an ISO that is going to be biodiversity related. So that standard is coming out. In fact, it's a BSI rather than ISO for now, but that will be coming in development as well. So that will give you a little bit of a guideline. But if you think about what nature actually is, as we've just broken it down, there will be a number of others that may be helpful, but only if those are the material topics for you. So you might actually go focus specifically on the action and how it's helping, rather than what ISO asks you, do you have a process? Because you don't want to read the process, you want the results.
That's great. No, thank you, Marina. Another question from Leroy, and get me paraphrasing, which is, I mean, the question is, do you need to start supply discussions bluntly with whether or not they want to go on the journey first? Because we wouldn't want to waste time with a supplier that is not serious or committed to changing. So I sort of interpret that question. It'd be good if you could answer that, but I guess my interpretation as well is, how do you balance nature-based requirements alongside other procurement requirements that you're going to have with the supplier?
I can certainly start to take that. I mean, we have that issue now with our own supply base, I should say. I don't think asking them if they want to go on the journey and then writing them off is necessarily the approach, because they actually might be really material to that topic area. But there is something to be said about pausing and parking them and sort of recognizing that you're maybe not going to sort of take them on the journey early on, and then sort of circle back to them at the end and see if their decision has changed based on your own maturity levels improving, based on the fact that you probably then have very good success stories with other suppliers that have actually shown progress in that space. So I think it's just about how you frequent suppliers as opposed to necessarily giving up on them entirely.
There's also something to be said about the level of responsibility of the client for the supply chain, especially sometimes when those suppliers may be smaller suppliers, or maybe they're more vulnerable suppliers, so maybe don't actually have access to resources or just ability for other reasons to do all of the same kind of things we may expect of maybe supplier that's larger and bigger. So there's been a number of instances, not nature related, where if you just drop the supplier, actually the impact is so much more detrimental, ethically as well as environmentally. So actually, if we're part of the same industry and part of the same supply chains, there is going to be a responsibility on a client who's essentially created that demand in the market to maintain and support those smaller suppliers. So what is the collaborative relationship you can shape and how it can be mutually beneficial before you actually come to an understanding, well, this is never going to work and definitely not going to happen, but that really should be the last resort. And that's not going to be helpful for your business as well as a sort of client reputation, and not going to be helpful for the wider supply chain and the sector and particular issue you're trying to solve. So always recommend it as going to be completely the last resort, that you abandon somebody because they can't actually meet your expectations.
And just building on that, Emma, in terms of, are you able to say at Avantor how you've actually chosen to communicate with any of your suppliers on the topic of nature? Can you build on Leroy and give him a bit more practical examples at all from that?
Well, I finally got nature into our strategy, which is quite exciting. So we've actually called out nature conservation as a sort of large topic area that then has other topics that sit with under it. Have we sorted it? So we're literally launching in June, to be fair, so next month. So have I decided fully on how I'm going to communicate the minutiae to suppliers? No, I think I'm going to take a hybrid approach where we explain that we're going big on nature, but then sort of at a sort of corporate level. But then when we do our sort of day-to-day interactions with suppliers, I think we're going to go in at a sort of subtopic level and not sort of confuse them with a sort of whole nature brand, nature narrative, because I don't think we'd get them to move. So I think there is something to be said about a hybrid approach. And maybe that sort of, you adapt it as you become more mature, but under no uncertain terms would I ever say that we're mature on nature at all. I think we're starting out like many of you, which is why I was able to kind of communicate some of these challenges, because we've had to face them recently.
Okay, thank you very much, Marina and Emma. Again, some fantastic content, and I hope that everyone in the audience got something from it. I'll probably hand over now to Joe to wrap up the session, but thank you very much again.
I've done that mistake. I kept on mute by mistake. As I've just posted in the chat, hopefully you've all found this session really, really helpful. We'd actually plan to limit this to 50 minutes today so that you can all grab a coffee, whatever, before your 2 o'clock meetings. It is a lunchtime session. We appreciate you taking the time. Emma, Marina, it's been a really useful session, so helpful, so practical, which is what we as SPP always like to have in terms of a few tips and takeaways and things for there. Hopefully everybody, so thank you for your time, and Marina, I'm glad we got the technology working for you today as well.
Absolutely.
If anybody wants to contact us with any other questions or anything, I put the email address in there that we've got. It's ukchapter@spp.earth, or add a quick chat or anything on here. We will be doing more sessions both on nature and biodiversity, and in the UK we do a mixture of in-person events and events online, and a variety of topics as our members of community want. So thank you all for your time today, and we will wrap up here, and we'll hopefully share the recording afterwards. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.